What's going on, guys? I am back again with another video. This is a portrait commission from late last year. I recorded the process for it and I didn't get around to editing it until just recently because I wanted to invest in some better sound equipment first and see how this would sound in comparison to my older videos. I'm still trying to figure it out and see how everything works. I'm not really that well versed with these type of things. And you have to forgive me, the sound is still not quite as crisp as it should be, but I'm playing around with it when I have the time. And yeah, man, I just wanted to get this video out as soon as I could. So this one was as I was saying, is a portrait commission from late last year, and I thought it would be fun to demonstrate this process, and this one in particular because he's outside and it's like late in the day and there's some subtle things happening with his skin in terms of the lighting. You got some purples and blues and oranges in there, and I thought that it would be interesting to show you guys how I would approach that type of scenario in any given drawing. So what I did was I started out with a cold erase sketch like I do in just about all of these drawings. This is an orange red pencil. I use those because it makes it easier for me to see what I'm doing when I'm trying to stay within the shapes. And I just keep it as simple as I can because I want the colors to do the majority of the lifting in these type of drawings. And from there, I started layering in some pale yellows and purples and blues and things like that, and just trying to build up those undertones gradually. This is a slow burn. You don't want to like jump into these things heavy-handed because it's easy to overstep your bounds really quickly, and you don't want to do that. You can correct a lot of mistakes early on if you just take a lighter approach in the beginning and build up those colors gradually. So over the course of this drawing, you will see as the colors start to get more saturated, I'll be bringing in darker colors and things like that, and it'll start to come together and things will start to make a little bit more sense. So this is a long one. It was originally about maybe 2-3 hours, and I tried my best to edit it down to about 1. So I'll be popping in, just providing a little bit of commentary here and there in certain parts of the drawing, just trying to explain what it is I'm doing. And yeah, man, hope you guys enjoy the process, and I'll see you again in a little bit. So what I did here was, after I finished putting in those lighter blues and yellows, I went in with the initial base skin tone, which is E13 light suntan. And this guy, he's a little bit dark skinned. He's a brown skinned guy. He's not really this light, but the idea here is that I'm using this reddish brownish color to kind of get those subtle colors in, those undertones first. And then as I start to build up those darker colors, you'll see it show through a little bit more. And I'm gonna have to play up a lot of those darker purples and blues along the way. So I'm using the chisel end to kind of like carve out those shadow shapes and those plane changes a little bit subtly, just to kind of give me a few landmarks to follow. Towards the edges of his face, there's like kind of a rim light effect going on, and I'm gonna be working around that as the drawing takes form. You'll start to see it pop out a little bit more. Right now it's still very light, so it's kind of hard to distinguish everything from each other. And oh yeah, and at this point here, he has some earphones in. I debated whether or not I should keep them in or take them out, but I figured I could just leave them in because they were kind of harmless. Having things like that to break up the drawing into smaller shapes helps a lot in terms of getting a smooth block of color when working with things like markers. The more that you can break up the drawing into smaller shapes, the better, because you don't have to cover a large distance trying to fill in these big gaps, and then you end up with splotchy, uneven color. So that's one of my little hacks. I like to try to fill those things in smaller whenever possible. And here I am just using a multi-liner to kind of define some of those features on his face, like his eyes and his nose, because already we're not even that deep into the drawing and I'm losing a lot of my pencil sketch, and I don't want to get lost in terms of the landmarks on his face. So I had to do a little bit something to kind of keep me from losing my way. And I'll play up those pencil, well, yeah, the pencil sketch and the ink. I'll play it up a little bit more as the drawing starts to take form. But for right now, this I think it should be enough. So at this point in the drawing, I am starting to bump up the saturation, and I'm using the light suntan again, which is the color that I used to get his base skin tone in initially. As you can see, it dried and it's a lot lighter than what it looked like when it went down at first. So I'm using the brush tip in now to get some fine detailing in there. And because I'm using the brush tip in, it's a little bit darker than the chisel end. You get more ink out of that end. And I'm using that to really define his eyes. In any given drawing, the eyes is usually what I would go for first, because I think that's what captures a lot of the personality, and I think it can make or break a drawing really easily. So I'm working my way around the eyes and in the brow, and I'm going to bridge all of these things together, the nose and the lips, and it'll start to look a little bit like something. And from there, we're going to kind of lasso in his forehead and his cheekbones and chin and things like that, and get those subtle plane changes. But first, I want to keep building up those subtle undertones that I was talking about earlier, because it's easy to get lost. Again, I don't want to go too dark too early, but I do want to start to define some of these shapes a little bit better, so things are reading a little bit more clearly. So right now I'm using a yellow orange on his face, and mixing it with like a golden yellowish color. but we still have a long ways to go. This doesn't even really look like anything just yet, but it'll look like something soon, so just stick with me. At this point, I started to feel a little bit more confident about putting in some darker colors, but I still played it relatively safe. I'm just coloring in his nostrils using a really dark brown, E49, which is dark bark. It's like a really dark brown. So I like to use that in place of black in a lot of drawings. Black can be a little bit overpowering in drawings like these, because although things can be like pitch black, rarely do you see that when you're trying to like capture something in a painting or a drawing. So it's one of those things where I was talking about trying not to go too dark too early. In this case, it makes sense for the nostrils to be as dark as they are, because it's, you know, there are holes in the nose and it's not much light getting up in there, at least not from this angle. So I'm using the multi-liner again to better define the shape of the nose, and it's starting to come together a bit. The nose is looking like it should for the most part at least. So I can start building up the surrounding areas right underneath his nose and his lips and things like that. We got some purples and some pinks up in there and some yellows. So his skin is starting to look a little bit like something. We still have a way to go, but it's gonna start coming together. I'm gonna fast track a lot of these details, get to his eyes, you get his eyebrows in there, and the drawing is starting to take shape. He's starting to get you know, the jawline and the cheekbone in there, and it's starting to look pretty good. So I finally started filling in his lips. It took me a minute to decide what color I should use initially to approach with his lips. With black people, sometimes you run into an issue where the lips are darker than the skin, or maybe a little bit lighter even. In his case, it was about the same as his skin color that I used for the base, and I just used the brush tip in. One, to get the detail. It's easier to get more detail with the brush tip in, and two, because it's darker than using a chisel in. And as I mentioned earlier, you can get a different range of values using the same colors even. And I haven't used many colors in this drawing so far at all. Maybe about 6 or 7 tops. I'm not sure. I didn't keep count, but I mean, it's common to use the same colors over and over again in a drawing like this and just build up the colors that way, because you can get a lot out of a little. So yeah, he had some pink in his bottom lip and a little bit of grayish purple, and even that should be a little bit darker once we get towards the end. Finally, we are finishing up his eyes, and we're going all the way in with some of those darker colors. The face is more or less defined. It's not quite finished. We still have a few layers to put on top of it, but we got all of our major landmarks in there. I can start to be a little bit more liberal in terms of the coverage, filling out his forehead and his cheekbones and things like that. I just want to fill in his eyes first, so he starts to look a little bit more human, a little bit more alive. His skin right now, technically you could call it and leave it like that, but I want him to have a little bit more life in his skin. He's look a little bit starved for oxygen as it is right now. So we're just gonna add a few more layers, some pinks in there, some browns and things like that. And the face will start to take on a more finished form. And from there, we're gonna just transition into the neck, kind of the same approach that we use for the face, same colors, more or less. And the shirt and the hair, and we'll be pretty much done. Right now, you can see I'm filling in his forehead again using the pink, and I'm using that. It's light enough for me to use as kind of a mid-tone to blend a lot of those colors in, and just dark enough to kind of fill out a lot of those gaps in color where it was looking a little bit too white underneath, a little bit too much of the page showing underneath the skin. But we're at a good point in the drawing now, and pretty soon he'll be all done. adding in some facial hair now. Facial hair is interesting because it can take on a wide variety of forms. In his case, he has a pretty thin mustache and a small goatee. It's not a whole lot, but he has a lot of whiskers and things like that. And trying to capture that with just a marker is kind of impossible, at least for me, at a drawing this size, because even with the brush tip in, it's too thick for me to get those fine hairs. So what I'm going to have to do first is I'm going to use these grayish brown colors to kind of build up that 5 o'clock shadow that you would see in most men that grow beards. And then after that, I'm going to add in a few whiskers and a little few specks and things like that using Copic multi-liner pens, and I think even a gel pen at the end to kind of get some of those reflections from the light. And yeah, we're filling in his hair. It's going to be a similar approach, but not quite as complicated. It's thicker. Black people have coarse hair, and in his case, you can get away with just a few colors because it's just a very solid block of color. It's not a whole lot involved. I'm not going for super detailed, refined curls and things like that. I just want the general shape. The main focus for me in this drawing is his face because it's a portrait. So we just want to do enough to get some convincing hair in there. If you want it to look like hair, but you don't want it to get too busy because you end up with hair that looks unrealistic and kind of silly. So that's our base color. It's going to be a lot darker than that. We're going to add some purples and blues in there, I believe, and it'll look a little bit more lifelike. It'll have a kind of a fuzzy like appeal to it. So we jumped up quite a bit. I didn't want to bore you guys with the details in his neck. It was more or less the same approach with his skin, with his face rather. And the only real difference here is that big cast shadow on his right and the creases in his neck. And the creases, it's kind of subtle. I don't want it to be too deep and too harsh to define, because he'll start to look like an action figure maybe, or something like that. So I had to kind of get those things in just as subtly as possible, because I don't want it to look weird. But I did use the same approach that I used with his face, the same logic, and I'm just building up those shadows. I'm working around the strings on his earphones, and once I'm done with that, adding in this cast shadow from the earphones, I'll be able to work on his shirt. At that point, I think the last thing in the drawing is me using a gel pen for some subtle highlights here and there. I know in his eyes I'll have one, and some on the earphones to kind of break him up from the background on his neck. And yeah, I think that'll be it for it. Real quick, I wanted to talk about how I did his shirt, because his shirt is technically black, but because of the lighting conditions, there's a lot more going on than it seems. So there's a cool aspect to it that I wanted to capture using this light purple bluish color. And on top of that, I'm going to add some brown, and it's going to start to look like a black shirt, but it's not going to be black if you examine the colors closely. And I forget where I learned this. I think it was maybe in college or something, but it has something to do with not using black. I don't know how he put it. I want to say he said, don't use black in your paintings. This is when I was taking an oil painting class back in college, and his the way he described it was that the black makes things look too much like a cartoon, and for that reason you want to find colors that have a lot of contrast, but also that I guess makes sense within the lighting conditions of that drawing or that subject or whatever. In his case, he has a lot of warm and cool colors going on in his skin, in his shirt. So you want to use something to complement that. In this case, I used brown, but in other cases, I know I've used like a dark green and things like that. And then the complementary colors alongside it can help kind of define what you're looking at. And I guess it plays a trick on your eye, and it makes you think that you're looking at something that's black, when in reality, if you zoom in, it's more of a brown color or a bluish color. It's one of those things about color theory that's kind of interesting, that's kind of hard to put into words. I would suggest looking at James Gurney's book, Color and Light, because it touches on this thing a lot better than I could ever describe it. But yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, to me at least. I think that any serious artist should have that book in their collection, because it'll open your eyes to a lot of different things in terms of color. So now I'm using that multi-liner again. I'm using the brown, and it's the same logic as before. I'm using brown and not black for his facial hair because that's more accurate to what the eye would see. And I'm using that one as well as a warm gray, and I'm just trying to keep it a little bit random and sporadic. I'm not trying to have the hair looking too uniform because then it looks unnatural. But I'm using that to add in some fine details, not really even just for his hair, but also for like his mouth, and I think I used it on his ears earlier in the drawing, and maybe I do it again, I can't remember. But I'm just trying to get in a lot of those flyaway hairs and whiskers and things like that. He has more on his jawline and his cheeks, and of course his mustache, which I think I saved that towards the end. But it's you got to do this one carefully because I didn't want to give him a mustache that's too full or too thick. I wanted to kind of build it up a little bit more gradually. So I use a lighter multi-liner here just to be safe and to see how I like it. And even then I felt like that was pushing it a little bit too much. So you gotta kind of have to test these things out. I use a scratch sheet of paper a lot when I draw to kind of test out different colors or pens and things like that to see how they might look in the drawing before I put it on the paper, because once it's down you can't do anything about it but work around it and hope for the best. The drawing is pretty much done at this point. Now we're just adding in some fine details. I'll be using some cold erase pencils to kind of add some more subtle lighting on top of the drawing. I just use the pencils to kind of put in some tones, and then I blend it out using a not a cold erase, but a cotton swab, and that helps me get some nice lighting effects. Sometimes I use it to make something glow. Sometimes I use it to make something look a little bit more rosy or lifelike in the skin. In his case, I'm using yellow to try to get that sun up in there, and I'm going to blend it out a little bit, and I'll do the same thing, in his neck and stuff like that. I'm going to use the pens to get a little bit more details, and then I think lastly, a white pencil and a white gel pen, and that'll be pretty much it. So I reached the end of the drawing, and I'm using this warm gray to pretty much just push him forward, because this drawing didn't have a full background in it. It was just him. I needed to do something to help make him pop against that white background, because we got some brighter colors at the edge of his face and neck with the rim light going on, and the white earphones, or the cords on the earphones. So I just wanted to do a little bit of something to kind of help make him pop a bit more, and that was it. And yeah, that's the end of this drawing. He liked the drawing a lot. He made it his profile picture on social media. I'm going to throw up the reference for you guys. You can let me know how I did, you know, in terms of capturing his likeness and the colors and all of that stuff. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you again soon with the next one. And until then, take care of yourselves. Peace.